Friends, welcome back to the second major panel of Opera Conference 2021. It's called The Politics of Art. In the session description on our website, we asked a question. We said, while companies have become more active cultural citizens, is it time for them to emerge as cultural activists around issues that strengthen social cohesion and vibrant communities? In her excellent lead presentation on Monday, Christia Mercer said, the politics of opera go beyond its transformative effects on individuals, however important those are. She rooted her comments in the writings of Aristotle and noted that because we are human beings, we will flourish only if we are responsible to those around us. By implication, Dr. Mercer extended this, saying, the health and well-being of every single one of us is dependent on our community, and the health of our community is dependent on us. She went on. She explained that for Aristotle, a community will be healthy only if its members, and especially the community leaders, steer their community toward communal responsibility and health. And she considered opera leaders to be community leaders. She quoted Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, emphasizing his point that, and I quote, there's no such thing as policy or politics that are race neutral, because to do nothing is to do something important, namely, to maintain the racist status quo. In other words, if you're not part of the solution, you're very much part of the problem, end quote. Now, this point of his applies not only to racism, but to violence against women, to prejudices and violence around sexual identity, inadequate treatment of veterans, and inequities in the public education system, which many of our opera education programs seek to address, at least to some extent. Our panelists today demonstrate 2 points. The first is art's power to address important issues of today. The second is that we have a panel of creative artists and company leaders who've made decisions to steer their communities toward communal responsibility and health. Our distinguished panelists are Torrie Allen, President and CEO of Arts Midwest, and in his distant past, the General Director of Anchorage Opera, my good friend and colleague Teresa Eyring, who's the Executive Director of Theater Communications Group, John Humes, the CEO and Artistic Director of Nashville Opera, and the producer of the opera One Vote One, Cerise Jacobs, executive producer of Whitesnake Projects, and creator and librettist for the opera Death by Life. Dave Ragland, a composer and co-creator of One Vote One. Kimberly Reed, film director and producer, librettist and co-creator of the opera As One. Reed Smith, the general director of Anchorage Opera and a producer of As One. And Tazewell Thompson, director, playwright, librettist, is currently the director of opera studies of the Manhattan School of Music, and he is co-creator of the award-winning opera Blue. The discussion will be led by a man who gets credit for this session. In the last round of civic action grants, he appreciated the good work of many of our applicants, but he regretted that their efforts seemed separated from clearly articulated core values, separated from clear commitments to steer their communities toward communal responsibility and health. And it was his suggestion that led to the creation of this very session. I'll rejoin the session with questions from the audience and again at the end of this session. But it's with gratitude and great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Antonio Cuyler, Director of the Master's Program and Associate Professor of Arts Administration at Florida State University. Antonio, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. First, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from Tallahassee, Florida, where the Appalachian Nation, Muskogee Creek Nation, Miccosukee Tribe of Florida, and the Seminole Tribe of Florida stewarded the land. I pay respect to their elders, past and present, their descendants, to the generations yet unborn, and to all Indigenous people. Love's profundity comes from our greatest sacrifices for it. What will you sacrifice for love? More specifically, what will you sacrifice for the love of humanity? Your individualism, your power, your privilege? According to Americans for the Arts, 73% of US citizens believe that the arts help them to understand other cultures better. Furthermore, 72% believe that the arts unify communities regardless of difference, fostering social bridging and bonding across cultures. If this is true, might we use opera to promote social change? Perhaps we can also engage opera as a tool to help people discover the adventure of what it means to be human. However, to do this, we must fearlessly go places that our missions may compel us to go, but some artists, audiences, boards, donors, and staff may not always agree that we should go. In my professorial roles at Florida State University and the University of Michigan, I teach cultural policy. Yet, despite what some people may believe, the US has a cultural policy. For example, Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution grants Congress the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. The International Journal of Cultural Policy defined cultural policy as the prohibition or promotion of cultural practices and values by corporations, governments, institutions, and individuals. This understanding of cultural policy will frame the questions we explore in today's panel, the politics of art. To close, my favorite author, James Baldwin, said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Let us work together to face change." And now to share their responses to the questions, what obligation do arts organizations have to engage with the important issues of today? And how can arts leaders make the case for taking positions that may be interpreted as political? We'll start with Torrie Allen, President and CEO of Arts Midwest.
Thank you, Antonio. It's good to be here. I believe the obligation arts organizations, specifically opera companies, have to engage with important issues is deeply rooted in the very DNA of opera. Opera is born out of the need of our species to express itself. For thousands of years, people have come together in presentational forms, combining words with string, wind, and percussion instruments, dance, singing, acting, makeup, and costumes to express the stories of their past, their present, and their future. This has and always will include the real, or verismo, which is fundamentally inclusive of politics. Some of my favorite works include The Marriage of Figaro, where Figaro's opening aria confronts the oppressive system that allows kings to sleep with the wives of their servants, or in Tosca, set in Rome during the final days of Neapolitan rule. At one point in the work, Puccini is unable to resist the direct messaging of politics and has Cavaradossi sing for justice and liberté. I believe the challenge for arts leaders is to do this work with the wit of Figaro and the courage of Cavaradossi, knowing that showing up in these spaces linguistically fluent without taking the actions needed for actual systemic transformation is meaningless. Avoid performative gesturing and start in your own companies. It's confusing and counterproductive if you publish statements and commission or produce operas in this vein if your staff is underpaid or mistreated, or if there are substantial equity issues in your organization. And don't do this to advance your personal careers. Make the investment of time and dollars needed to help your audiences and communities understand that opera is glorious and essential and must constantly evolve. If we do this, if we lead with sincerity and deep commitment, it isn't politics. It's classic, unapologetic opera at its very best. Thank you.
Thank you, Torrie. Next, we'll hear from Teresa Eyring, the Executive Director of Theater Communications Group.
Thank you, Torrie. Oops, I'm sorry. Thank you, Torrie, and thank you, Antonio. Hi, everyone. I'm zooming from the unceded lands of the Lenape people, also known as New York. The American nonprofit resident theater movement gained momentum in the early 1950s and 60s and was led by visionaries such as Zelda Fichandler, founder of Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. It formed in response to what was at the time an entirely commercial for-profit ecosystem of theater making. She said, once we made the choice to produce our plays, not to recoup an investment, but to recoup some corner of the universe for our understanding and enjoyment, we entered into the same world as the library, museum, university, and church, and became an instrument of civilization. Since then, the US arts field has grown exponentially with thousands of arts organizations across the land. These hubs of imagination and beauty are also outposts of a network of artistic collaborators that spans the continent and the globe. And so not only are we able to create beautiful works that engage, inspire, and often bring peace and understanding to local communities, but the expanse of artists, administrators, trustees, and more who know each other and have built trust through the collaborative nature of the artistic process also gives us the ability to mobilize together for discussion, awareness, and action on the vital issues facing our society today. We can advocate on Capitol Hill for policies that affect the arts, and we do. While nonprofits can't organizationally back a particular candidate, they can encourage people to vote, even offering voter registration in their facilities, which many of our theaters do. If all organizations with endowment investments, those billions of dollars of investments in all nonprofit organizations that are fortunate enough to have endowments, adopted ESG, environmental, social, and governance standards, we could have an impact on reversing the climate disaster, which many scientists say we have less than 10 years to do. If we name the racism that exists within our sector and call it for what it is, unacceptable, and we work diligently toward equity and building systemic anti-racism within our organizations and wider ecosystem, then our arts community can actually lead in bringing about a culture and a civilization that is just, inclusive, and creatively abundant, rather than just sitting by and replicating the injustices that currently exist. There is an organizing and communications power we have as a performing arts sector that includes and also goes beyond the art itself. Failure to activate that power is a loss. It's a loss for ourselves and for our role in the civilization we occupy. It is tantamount to silencing ourselves and others while the injustices mount up around us. It is also leaving potentially opportunity and resource on the table. And so, what obligation do arts organizations have to engage with the issues of the day? Let me just say this. It is a choice, and the choice not to engage is a loss. Given the immense creative capacities, relationships, and networks we have, I hope we don't choose complacency. I pray that we will not choose to lose. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Next, we'll hear from composer Dave Ragland.
Oh, here it is. Okay. All right. So the early 90s was a very pivotal time for me. I remember my big sister beating me up for the remote control for the TV so she could watch MC Lyte and Queen Latifah on MTV, talking about the current issues in the Black community and strong statements on self-respect. I remember hearing in my house the sound of my dad's 8-track player, playing songs of Isaac Hayes and James Brown all over the house. And I remember on Sunday mornings in particular, my pastor of the family church insisting that every first Sunday, we all have to sing Lift Every Voice and Sing. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but my life was embedded with instances of music with a message. I do believe that arts organizations have an obligation to engage communities where they are located and tackle important issues. This can be handled through community engagement, through arts organizations working closely with community leaders to understand what the needs of the community are. Communities need arts exposure for its enrichment. Opera needs community presence for its existence. The position of arts leaders can be that of pro-community. So for One Vote One, the message of One Vote One is not necessarily left, right, or middle. It is to understand what the suffragists and civil rights activists went through to secure the right to vote, and understanding why exercising that right to vote is relevant today, as an example. So I'll close with saying that the 90s was also a time where, at least to my memory, I saw my first opera in person. La Boheme, presented by Chattanooga Symphony and Opera, where I'm from. Albeit, it took me a while to actually make the connection that La Boheme, one of the most famous operas, was a story about the haves and the have-nots, really just have-nots trying to figure out how to get by. But anyways, in creating One Vote One with the National Opera and other works that I've done, Eight Tones for Elijah with the National Ballet, and some other things as well, I've hoped that my music would be as much relevant and eye-opening experience for a young student now as my exposure way back when to Puccini and MC Light.
Thank you, Dave. Next, we'll hear from Cerise Jacobs.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much, Antonio. Whitesnake Projects is an activist opera company. We integrate activism into art making and art making into activism. For us, engaging with the important issues of today is an imperative, not an obligation. Now more than ever, art is political, and art making is a political act. There is no neutral position. When we choose to produce only so-called safe works from the traditional repertory without addressing problems inherent in these pieces, that's not being neutral. That's a political statement. Whitesnake chooses to create operas on contemporary issues, including immigration, multiculturalism, and in our opera premiering tomorrow entitled Death by Life, we deal with mass incarceration, an end point of racialized policing. It's our response to the murder of George Floyd. We will explore the activist ecosystem we built around the opera in the case study later in the program. The provocation for today's panel asks, how can arts leaders make the case for taking positions that may be interpreted as political? The world is changing. The US will be a majority-minority country by 2045. We can be leaders shaping this future, or we can be dragged into it. Opera that explores political issues should not be propaganda or didactic messaging. It's made like any other opera and judged by the same artistic criteria. There is no need to be defensive about good art. It speaks for itself. So for me, the key to art making on social justice issues is to tell authentic stories with strong dramatic arcs. I'll venture to say that most of us here have not experienced directly the impacts of long-term incarceration. I personally come from such privilege. So to tell the story in Death by Life, we collaborated with a community of activists with lived experience of the US carceral system. Texts by incarcerated writers form the libretto. Some of our singers are formerly incarcerated individuals. The key art we use in advertising, such as my virtual Zoom screen, is by Ronaldo Hudson, who served 37 years on death row. That's the model we've developed for making contemporary opera. We build an ecosystem of partners who are thought leaders in their areas of advocacy to broaden the landscape of what an opera company does. We envision a new kind of opera company, one which is about not just performance, but performance with purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Cerise. Thank you, Cerise. Next, we'll hear from Kimberly Reed.
Thanks very much, Antonio. And thank you to Opera America for convening this really important discussion. I'm speaking to you from Lenape, Muncie land. So the remarks that I prepared say, if it's all right, I'd like to flip the script and take a different tack, but everybody who has spoken so far has already flipped the script. So hopefully I won't flip it back, because what I wanted to say was that instead of talking about what positions may be interpreted as political, that I'd encourage us to think about whether art and the positions that arts organizations must inevitably take is ever not political. I would argue that all artistic expression is political in one way or another. It's created that way because it emerges from librettists and composers and performers and designers who all toil in a political world, imbuing characters who have no choice but to endure the same plight. When we place characters in conflict with each other, it always has a political component, something that can be emphasized or understated by arts organizations, but cannot be erased. Even in the simplest drama, say a love story between two characters, political acts like reinforcing existing power structures, values, and ethics are committed with even the simplest love story. Think about who it is who gets to fall in love. What gender are they? What color are they? What class? So I'd say it's the obligation of arts organizations to simply recognize that everything they present is political. Each piece either reinforces our current power structures or phobias or discriminations, or it holds them to account. If we don't, the opera character who is other with a capital O really will be reviled for their exoticism, or perhaps even vaunted for that exoticism. The disabled opera character will be seen as nothing more than crippled. And the hysterical soprano really will somehow deserve to die in the end. None of this is to say that we can't love and present the classical the classic repertoire, or that every piece must grab politics by the throat and wrestle it to the ground. We all just need to keep it in a political context and acknowledge that it is incumbent upon us all in conception, in creation, and directing, and conducting, and casting, and performing, and educating. It's incumbent to recognize that every gesture we make is inherently political. Each of us is either part of the problem or part of the solution. We can't be satisfied avoiding racism or sexism or homophobia or transphobia. We must be anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-phobic. There is no middle ground, no apolitical production.
Thank you, Kimberly. And our final panelist will be Tazwell Thompson.
Am I on? I'm sorry. Apologies. Thank you, Antonio. I am Zooming to you from my home here in Harlem, New York City. The times are uncertain and forbidding on many levels for most of us these days. There is a rise of all kinds of isms. We are challenged during this divisive atmosphere to stay close and supportive. Here's hoping that America will have the wisdom and ferocity to plow under its recent blunders and commit to building another kind of world, a world of intentionality and wholeness and beauty and reverence and respect for the differences among peoples that add richness, variety, and diversity to our lives. Here's hoping that in our 21st century, each of us will open ourselves a little further into awareness and the capacity to attend, to listen, to see and feel what is going on inside and outside of ourselves. To be woke, to become part of the others, those that are immediately around us, and those who are further off, lost, ignored, forgotten. I rejoice that there is such a mechanism as the theater, the opera theater, where writers, librettists, composers, working together with singers, actors, musicians, and other artists can connect themselves to our world, pierce through its dark, divisive density, and show to our fellow humans something of its mystery and violence and terror and inequities and oppression and pity and humor and love and our capacity to change. We invite you, dear gracious titans of business and industry. We invite you, wonderful women and men of foundations. We invite you, necessary and insightful trustees of boards. We invite you to follow, not lead, but to follow, to attend, and listen to us sing the new stories, the new issues, the new experiences that must be sung. Here, we are handing you a hymnal, your own hymnal, your own personal score to sing with us. Come, let us sing together. Thank you.
Thank you all for your reflections and comments about those two questions. Based on your responses, we have a lot to discuss this afternoon. But first, I would like to welcome our two additional panelists. Joining us today is John Humes, CEO and Artistic Director of Nashville Opera, and Reed Smith, General Director of Anchorage Opera. So to start, I'd like to ask everyone, if you will, to tell us or share with us today, what is the most important social issue to you and why? And I'm going to let you all jump in as you will, so that it can be an emergent conversation instead of calling on people.
Hello, everyone. I'm Reed Smith, General Director of Anchorage Opera. Right now, I'm concerned with the treatment of Indigenous peoples because I'm working on a US premiere of the opera Missing.
Thank you, John.
This is, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, Dave, I wanted to jump in and say that for me, for a number of years, I've been focused on the existence of racism, structural racism within our sector, and the unacceptability of that because of what we stand for as artists and culture bearers and makers. And there is an interconnectedness between that and other issues such as the treatment of Indigenous peoples and the way in which we treat our planet.
Thank you,
I'll
Teresa.
jump in here. I live at so many intersectionalities. I mean, I'm a woman, I'm Chinese ethnically, I'm an immigrant, I'm short, I'm just a lot of things. And so, and of course, having personally experienced a lot of marginalization. So for me, I think any issue that marginalizes people is something that we take a closer look at. So lately, the focus has been back to, as it should be, refocusing on Black Lives Matter and systemic racism as it impacts everybody in the United States. So that's what we look at. We also look at issues from the pandemic, such as the disparate impacts the pandemic has on Black and Brown lives. We made an opera about that called Alice in the Pandemic. So I think that we are very off the moment, and it's hard to say in particular what social issue is most important to the company. I think we try to respond to whatever the social issues are that we live in.
Thank you, Cerise.
I would just say that as an American, I think that anybody who's on this ground needs to pay attention to the systemic injustices against Black people and Indigenous people in our country. I'm also, as a transgender person, acutely aware of the fact that, like, for right now, for example, 33 out of 50 US states have laws targeting trans kids. It's barbaric. So that issue is on the front burner for me right now.
And for me, it's systemic injustice, but also how do you step into this space and make systemic change, right? So I think we're going to talk about how people actually show up. Like, you're going to have to show up with sincerity. You're going to have to show up with cavadosi, with figaro, no more performative. The performative doesn't work. So how do we attack the performative and really get people to really change, really walk the talk?
Antonio, because of my work, especially my work with Dave Ragland, who is here, one of the things I've been very concerned about and concentrating on, and our company has, is just everyone having a voice. And the show that Dave and I did was about the right to vote and how your vote matters. And it disturbs me seeing what's going on around the country with voter suppression, especially focused on certain groups.
Thank you, John. And Torrie and Kimberly and Reed, Cerise, Teresa, Dave, and Tazwell, we haven't heard from you.
Yes, well, all the issues that have been mentioned concern me, of course, as well. During the pandemic, which is not completely over, and then with the bold and brazen for the world to see murder of George Floyd, I could easily Photoshop or transpose myself to that person, George Floyd, lying in the street, and that arrogant police officer with his hands in his pocket and a smirk on his face, who snuffed out the life of this man lying beneath him, who he did not recognize as even a person. So the issue for me is not police reform, because I don't think there will ever be a police reformation during my lifetime. The endemic racism that is so pervasive in this country. Here we are in 2021, and since 1619, we have had to grapple with this issue, this problem, this landscape that will never disappear as long as Black men, women, Black boys and girls walk this earth. It's very sad and very depressing. And I mentioned the pandemic to begin with because it was in that despair of being confined to my apartment for months was also coupled with the fear of walking out once again, and who should I confront? Do I confront a police officer? And I have had many confrontations with police officers. So this conversation, though very necessary, is very difficult for me.
And understandably, Tazwell.
Yeah,
Dave.
I was going to say, kind of in that similar vein, that this question is always interesting when it's proposed to me. It's like, how do you ask this kind of question to people who have been in traditionally suppressed groups versus those who may not have? We can all look at a pyramid, and one person sees a triangle, one person sees a square. It's kind of like approaching it as far as that, in my opinion. I mean, I am very much Black male, and that's the same thing with Mr. Thompson. When I go out, I'm always going to be, from sun up to sundown, I'm going to be Black. I never wake up in the morning and say, wow, I feel so diverse. I never feel, let me put on my oppression today. It's just a part of my embodied experience as far as who I am and how I have to move and operate and exist in society. So for me, an issue may be hot button for me, but it may not be hot button necessarily for someone else. And that's part of the disparity, because as the old novel says, your blues ain't like mine. So it's really, how can we get kind of on one page? Will we ever get on one page? Will, for any one group of people, be there one particular issue that we need to tackle this first? No, we need to tackle this first. No, how about this one? So this is just, I think, kind of the conundrum that even as arts people, we're in and we're faced.
Thank you, Dave. I'm so glad that you said that, because given the variety of social issues explored in the operatic repertoire, i.e. police brutality, racial oppression of LGBTQS plus people, voting rights, just to name a few, how did you all select the social issue you tackled in your work?
Well, Antonio, for me, the issue kind of surfaced when I took over the company. Not too long after taking over the company, that we had George Floyd murdered. And I'm based here in Minneapolis, although we oversee the Midwest. And my staff immediately insisted, I'm running a culturally and historically white organization, and they insisted on putting out a statement. And my response was, look, we have no credibility in this space. People are dying. This is a serious issue. Statements are meaningless. They're especially meaningless for organizations like ours. Now, what we're going to do is plot out a course that will give us credibility over the next 3 years. So 3 years from now, we can put out a statement and it has meaning, but we will be doing things. We will be showing up. We will be reporting out how we're actually trying to make or address systemic change. And so it surfaced for me on the job with 30 other staffers trying to convince these folks that the statement is meaningless.
Yes, Cerise.
Yeah, I want to follow up, Torrie, on what you just said. I felt the same way at Whitesnake Projects, that a statement, words are cheap. This is not to say that they are not meaningful, of course they are, but we needed to do more. So what we did was we immediately convened a brain trust of activists, and we brainstormed a response through opera to the George Floyd murder. And one of the topics that came out of that trust was the intersection of systemic racism and mass incarceration. And that was how Death by Life, the opera, which we're going to premiere tomorrow night, was born through an activist think tank. And as a result of that, through these activists, we managed to network into the community of incarcerated writers, families, individuals, and together build this opera.
Thank you, Cerise. Yes, Reed.
So when I first moved to Anchorage to take over the company, I wanted to make sure that the company was relevant in the community. So I looked to the community to discover what issues might be relevant to the community. And we started off with Maria de Buenos Aires because there's a large Spanish-speaking community in Anchorage. And certainly that you can make the case that it's about the mistreatment of a woman. Then we moved to Glory Denied, which is about the longest held POW in American history that happened during the Vietnam War, because Alaska has more retired military personnel per capita than any other state. That was very effective, and we actually had Senator Sullivan speak at one of our performances, and Senator John McCain recorded a video, and he sent that to us to play before each performance. Then we moved to As One, which Kimberly knows very well. And that was a fantastic success, and it coincided with the placement on the municipal ballot of a bathroom bill that would take away the protections that transgender people in Anchorage enjoyed at the time. After that, we did An American Dream, which is a story of internment of Japanese. And not only were Japanese in Alaska interned, but also Alaska Natives, Aleutians, were interned into much worse conditions, even according to the Japanese that were interned. And we wanted to relate that to the story as well. Then we ended up, before COVID, we did Frida, who is, of course, was bisexual. She was disabled. She was a victim of violence. And also she was a recovery from polio, which related to actually Rotary clubs, believe it or not. Coming up, we're doing the US premiere of Missing, which is about missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I look to the community to tell me what we could do to tell stories, pass on information, encourage people to think about these issues, and act accordingly.
Thank you, Reed. Anyone else?
And Antonio, when we were creating the recent piece we did, One Vote One, my company was originally asked to be a part of a commemoration of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And so it was going to be, every arts group in town was going to do something. And then COVID, of course, came in. But a little before that, we were looking at something to do. And I was doing research on women's suffrage, and I kept finding information about Black women's suffrage, which honestly, I knew nothing about. And I talked to my state historian, and he said, you should look into this. And so I did. And it was very interesting. And again, something I never learned in school, I never heard about before. And so I called, I brought Dave Ragland in, and he and I talked, and I said, Dave, I'd like to do a show about this, and I'd like you to write the music. I'd like you to find the librettist. And so I started the project, but I intentionally handed it to Dave and his librettist, Mary McCallum, because although I started the project and I could help produce it, I didn't feel it was my story to tell. And so I wanted to give Dave and Mary freedom. And that's really how this started. But I felt it was an important topic. And like I said, it's a topic that I just didn't know about. But once you got into it, it was an amazing topic. And then Dave took that and ran with it.
And there's so much resonance with that piece, and you know, Black women voting today, even, and shifting the political sands in which we're living in. So, thank you for sharing that, John. Anyone else? Kimberly?
Yeah, I would just say that, I mean, if the question is like, how did we select a social issue to tackle, as one of the co-creators of As One with my co-librettist Mark Campbell and composer Laura Kaminsky, I mean, we all come from the queer community. I think many of us who come from marginalized communities feel like we don't go out looking for social issues to select. This, like, they select us, and that by drawing on, in my case, my own lived experience as a trans person, to create something, to create a piece that could humanize trans folks for members of the audience, that's what was behind it all.
Thank you, Kimberly. It's always interesting to get that artistic side of this kind of work, because I imagine that opera companies who might be looking to start doing this work may wonder, well, do you start with the social issue, or do you start with the like, is there an opera in the repertoire that we can use to kind of match with the social issue? Where do we start? And I think the answer may be, and I'm not sure if you all agree with this, is that you can start at a multiplicity of points, because maybe tackling a social issue is an opportunity to expand the operatic repertoire, particularly if there's not an opera that addresses certain particular social issues. Anyone else want to respond to that question? Teresa.
Yes, and I'm going to respond from the perspective of my organization, TCG, which is not a producing artistic organization, but we do produce events, and we produce a magazine, and we publish plays. And we recently went through a strategic planning process where our new mission, or we restated our mission as to lead for a just and thriving theater ecology. And one of the things that we named is that we are going, within our programming, that we will, in our decision process, center Black and Indigenous and theaters of color and people of color even more than we have. And so the way that's showing up is in our magazine, in American Theater, the magazine we publish is really just making sure that those stories and voices are more and more centered in the storytelling and the reporting, and also that we're making sure that we are naming and reporting on situations of injustice in the theater field, which, is a service organization for our publication. To do that is a big deal. We shifted to say, we're going to name these things and we're going to report on them. And so that's happening. But also, one thing we did with magazine this year is we had a couple of issues that were community edited. And we had one issue that focused on trans and non-binary theater artists and practitioners, and we had an actual advisory that community edited that issue, as well as an issue that was community edited by the disability members of the disability community. So that work, and then also in the book area, I mean, some of the plays that are being written today, our publisher sometimes says we're in a golden age of playwriting, and so many of those writers are writers of color, women, trans and non-binary writers. And so we're really trying to make sure that we're centering those voices and bringing them out through our distribution mechanisms so that the world is able to read those plays and see those plays produced.
Thank you, Teresa. Anyone else want to respond to that question? Okay, well, we'll move on to the next question, which gets into the civic practice, and in certain other spaces, it's called community engagement. How did you choose a non-cultural organization in which to partner on addressing a social issue? right? Because, you know, we have the cultural organization, which can be an opera company. And because the opera company may not be the expert in the particular social issue, how do you go about selecting whom to partner with, who can bring those expertise about the social issue in your community, particularly to raise up whatever social issue you're trying to address through the civic practice?
You know, for me, Antonio, I think this brings up the opportunity for companies that aren't able to commission new works to do standard work, to do standard rep, but they can have an advisory panel or local community advisory council that can sort of make recommendations, and they can contextualize this production. You know, it doesn't have to be over one weekend. It could be over an entire year or entire season. And there's so many opportunities to contextualize this and connect with so many different organizations if you explore the common humanity in all of these works. And so I think that partnering with cultural organizations opens up a rainbow of opportunities to really walk the talk for organizations.
Thank you, Torrie.
I'm not sure whether it's the artist has the availability or what is it? If he gets to choose or she gets to choose what organization or civic organization or what business funding will come around with what the artist feels necessary for them to write and to compose. I wish it were. I wish we did have that that power, that availability to us, that we decide what we're going to write and where it's going to go. It doesn't happen that way. So we don't get to choose, or at least I don't get to choose, where our work is performed, produced. We write and hope and pray, I think. And, you know, and hopefully, you know, that there will be these organizations, these artistic organizations that allow us to write the works that must be written, especially what we've all endured and all of us have survived in during these very, very difficult times. I'm just really hoping and praying that we've had this time to incubate and to look around outside of ourselves and want to hear the story that goes on, not only in the next block and in the next town, but right in our own immediate circle, where we, you know, our friends, our families, the religious centers that we attend. Also what's going on overseas in Israel and Gaza. And I wish I could say that I am hopeful and that there will be these arts organizations that will go out and seek the funding that is necessary for us to tell these new stories. But I'm not sure what the audiences will want to see when this is all over and we go to those next new steps, and what the boards of trustees, what they will allow for these CEOs and general directors and artistic directors for us to produce. Will we go back to these wonderful operas, these tried and true heavyweights of the opera repertoire, or will they allow us to tell these new stories from these new experiences that we've all come through?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Kimberly.
Just following up on what Taz said so beautifully, I think you said write and hope and pray. And as creators, we have certainly done a bunch of that. And every once in a while, we put suggestions out there about how different producers can get in touch with their local organizations. And some, like Reed Smith and what they did in Anchorage, which is magnificent, the number of groups that they were able to reach out to and connect with. And related to your question is like Laura Kaminsky and Mark Campbell and I have come across just a dearth of trans and non-binary singers And we're wanting these to be cast and these roles to be sung by trans and non-binary folks. But the training pipeline is just, there's not a lot of people stacked up and ready to go all across the US. So we're actually looking into creating a scholarship to train some of those. So we're going to be announcing it soon. Nothing, no breaking news here, but it's something that directly as creators, we've been trying to connect directly to kind of these local organizations. We just decided to go direct to it.
For us at Whites Make Projects, we don't actually choose an organization because a non-cultural organization. We partner with social justice organizations. It's always a two-way street. Most social justice organizations are under-resourced. And so for them to take on an opera project and collaborate with us is a huge burden on them. And we need to find the sweet spot where, as a partnership, we hear what they need, what they want, and we help them leverage their messaging. That's the only way to successfully partner with non-cultural institutions. It's not about us. It's not about opera per se. It's about how two different organizations occupying two different spaces can actually unite and help each other fulfill their respective missions and create a better vision.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that, Cerise, because I don't think that folks who are starting the work always think about the reciprocal benefits that can accrue to both the opera company and the social justice organization or non-cultural organization from doing this kind of work. Yes, Reed.
I would just like to add on to what Cherise said. Instead of choose, I would use the word invite, because oftentimes the opera company is going into this without any knowledge of what exists in their community in terms of groups that might be interested. So we always present it as an invitation, saying that we're doing this piece, that your mission, you may be able to further your mission by partnering with us. Can we meet? Can we talk about it? And in my initial conversation, I almost always say, and by the way, we are not looking for funding.
Thank you, Reed. Taz, I actually kind of want to circle back to the paradigm dynamic that you described between artists and companies or boards, because I wonder, what would it take for artists to lead more of these kinds of works, right? Like for the artists to kind of serve as the inception of these works based on whatever lived experience, and then go seek out the company to partner with them on doing the work. Like that dynamic is just interesting to me. And I wonder what can be done to change that or shift that a bit.
That is a great question, and it's hard to decipher how one would actually break through that conundrum, through that barrier, through that obstacle. I think it's very difficult, but it's not insurmountable and it's not impossible. I think one of the things that one must do is that old-fashioned way that one used to do years ago, when you would write a letter or send a resume or send your 8x10. You have to continue to hound, to stalk, to go after those theaters, those opera companies that attract you. Don't send it out to, email or social media. Every single organization in the world, every opera company, choose the ones that really attract you, because they're doing the kind of work that you closely identify with, that excites you, that is emotionally taps something inside of you and say, this is the place where I would love to work. I really want Francesca Zambello, for instance, to know my work. What do you do? She's not impossible to get in touch with. Yes, she has an assistant, and she, there's a little bit of a barrier to get directly to her. But start there. Start with a company that really says, oh, this particular company, whenever I hear about them or I see their work, their stage is filled with persons of color. And I'm speaking now about Francesca Zambella and Glimmer Glass Opera. Since she arrived, that has been her mission, that there would never be an opera on her stage that did not have persons of color on that. And she stuck to that, no matter what the opera is. And so I think find that organization, that artistic place, and see how you can become a member of that family, how you can make it your home. What is their mission statement? How does that align with how you think, how you breathe? What excites you about it? Look at the different librettists and composers and directors that have worked at those organizations. Do you identify with them? Do they look like you? And I think, going back to what I said, hound them, stalk them, politely, of course, but remind them, I'm out here, hello out there, I'm here, and this is what I'm doing. I'm doing a play at a storefront. I'm doing an opera in an attic. I'm going to be traveling at the back of a truck, and we're going to stop at 135th Street and Lenox Avenue. Please, please come. I'm giving you a whole month's notice, and then remind them the next week and the week after. That is the old-fashioned way of letting people know what you're up to. It's really the only way. If you are unknown. Now, if you've had some success, then you probably have an agent or a manager who can do that for you. But it's always good if you have that, your own personal touch. My name is Tazwell Thompson, and I've written something that I desperately would love for you to read, because you're the type of company that I know will take care of me. Start there.
Thank you. Dave, I can tell you had something to say.
It's always like humbling to come after Mr. Thompson. I promise. It's like, oh my God. Okay. But let me just say kind of two things. One is believability. One of my running jokes is when people meet me, it's always two questions. Number one, what do you do? I'm a composer. Two, are you any good? Without fail, and I'm sure we've all had that experience. It's like just kind of that already you're met with a barrier of resistance. Like, we don't believe, why are you wasting my time, kid? Is your music really any good? So even I would say for me coming up as a composer, you're already trying to mount over that obstacle as far as, is the work that you do really worth the time of the people you're trying to get it to? And I've been very fortunate, unfortunately, over this past year, that I've gotten some notoriety, people heard a piece or whatever. I won't say too much. But but that is, I would say, probably one hurdle. But I think in entertainment, we all have to kind of go through that, fortunately and unfortunately. And number two, I would say the issue of resource. In that, to kind of comment with Mr. Thompson saying, I've emptied out bank account. I wouldn't say I've done that. I mean, we've had to beg, borrow, steal, favors, churches, basements, whatever I got to do to put something on. And so, opera is not cheap. Pianists cost, printing scores cost. If I know somebody with a printer at a church who will let me copy scores, it's been a rat race. And so having the access for someone who's a composer, or maybe a polyhyphenate like myself, who's a composer and a singer, or what the new kids call it, the creators, content creators, having kind of that pipeline or channel of resource for someone like that, who maybe is doing the next, social justice issue. Like say I'm in Nashville, gentrification, which is a hot button issue here. The school to prison pipeline, the gentrification to prison pipeline. Having that type of, access and that allowance to allow a young composer or a young dramaturg to create, something like that or whatever issue. And that can be something that's spearheaded, with a company or somehow through maybe arts organizations in the city, Metro Arts, something like that. Because I was thinking the other day, I was watching the Met Councils, since it was virtual, and I was thinking, wouldn't it be cool if they had like a Met Council for composers or something like that? Even because there is no real, Met Council per se for composers. I'm just blabbing. But thinking about different ways to give the allowance, the time and the resource and trust for your creators of today.
Hey, Antonio,
Yes.
I would love to just pick up on something that Tazwell and Dave has said. And for me, that leads into the first point from Dave. And you described it as a hurdle. And from my observation, it's a high mountain. It's a high mountain. And so what can we do to actually make it a hurdle, right? And I think there's a way for us to embrace intelligent design, to start calling it out as a high mountain and working together in this industry to actually make it a hurdle, because it's a high mountain right now.
And I think Opera America does a good job with its idea grants, and but it is right. And so if funders are listening, more grants for composers to just do what they do, which is compose. In addition to resources, and particularly financial resources, what other challenges did you all experience engaging in social issues through civic practice in opera?
Well, when Whitesnake first started down this path, I should have expected it, but I have to admit I was surprised that several major donors actually reduced and even withdrew support. So, it was a test of our commitment to our mission. And I will say that we never got them back. And but what we have found is that the funding climate that the foundation have now, I think, been thought leaders in the area of social justice. And there are more opportunities that have opened up for those of us who are committed to social justice art making.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that, Cerise. Because I think one of the burdens or barriers to doing this work is, especially if I hadn't done it before, right? Like, I think I would think, okay, well, can we stand to lose major donors or board members if we move in this direction? And in some ways, I wonder if it's an opportunity to engage new donors and new board members who are, receptive and responsive to this kind of work.
Antonio, what I've discovered is that what's missing is the storytelling. And I find it ironic that we're in an industry that's about storytelling. And yet when it comes to doing the storytelling needed to bring the folks along who can support us, we kind of drop the ball there. And I think because most of the people, most of the funders, most of the folks out there, they're good folks. And if they're brought along, they'll support, they'll open up their bank accounts. But what happens is we come up with these great artistic ideas and we forget about, we also have to be internal storytellers to bring them along and not be judgmental. I've been in places where there's this ultra commitment to equity and there's a sense of judgment to those folks who aren't that far along. And those folks who aren't that far along are sometimes the folks with the deep pockets, right? They're good people, their heart is in the right place. They may not be using the language that sounds right, but their heart is in the right place. So if we can invest in the storytelling to bring them along, they'll be there. They'll be there. That's what opera's about.
Thank you, Torrie. Other challenges? Yes, Reed.
When we were doing An American Dream, I had hoped that I could really foster a dialogue and bring not only the Japanese community into this production, but also the Aleutian community. We did start working with the organization that is responsible for perpetuating the culture of the Aleutians and their health. And we had a commitment, and then all of a sudden, right a couple of weeks before the events were supposed to take place, silence from them. We were fortunate that we had speakers before the opera that were of mixed heritage, Aleutian and Japanese, and both had been interned. So we did reach the community in that way, but I view it as a failure. And I'm not to this day sure exactly why, but I know that there is some animus between on the Aleutians side because they were invaded by the Japanese and actually removed from their home islands and not allowed to return. So I just hope that it wasn't anything that I said or did that made this fail.
But that sounds like you learned something from that particular case, Reed.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I think we have questions also coming in from folks listening, and I'm happy to hear some of those questions and use the intelligence of our panelists to attack some of those.
Thank you so much, Antonio, and just everybody for such a rich, inspiring conversation. And the questions fall into two clusters as they've been fed to me. And in a way, there have been a couple of partial answers on this, a little bit from Torrie and Tazwell. The first one I'm going to take on is from a couple of people who've said, when we're talking about As One or Missing or some of the other works, it sounds like the new works that really turn toward our community to make it a better place are separate from the traditional opera work, so that you're doing Labo and Carmen over here, and you're doing Dead Man Walking and One Vote One over here, and a kind of implicit artificial dichotomy between the two lobes of the brain. And Torrie, you touched on this a little bit about engaging community conversation around the fundamental topics of some of the inherited repertoire. But I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about not making it, column A and column B, but actually making it a synthesized approach to opera.
Yeah, I can say I think that is the only approach. If we're really serious about this work, we can't have this false divide. I think that works against us. And that sort of, to me, that divide really speaks to systemic bias. It just feeds it. It's a feeder tube for systemic bias. I think we have to recognize that they aren't separate, that all of opera is political. All of opera is political. And if we begin to frame it that way and storytell it that way, I think our funders, the audience, the communities will begin to appreciate this new work that comes out, and then they'll understand that the connectivity with what we call the traditional stuff.
I'm curious, Teresa, do you have this potential for divide within theater companies and the repertoire they do, that play number 1 and 4 in a season is politically potent, and play number 5 and 7 are complete comedy distractions? I mean, how does the theater community look at creating a unified whole from its own inherited repertoire and new work?
I think many theaters are joining the two in their seasons. Some are dedicated exclusively to a classical repertoire. Some are very much more prioritizing new work, and some are very good at bringing them together and finding, to Torrie's point, finding the relevance in and the aspects to the work that speaks to everyone, or speaks to specific contemporary issues and concerns, regardless of whether they are contemporary works or classical. But as Tazwell knows, sometimes it's been the case also in the past that theaters have kind of relegated something that's new or something that might be a little more controversial or might not sell as many tickets to the smaller space. The less, instead of having it have a place on the main stage. That's where the dichotomy can happen. The other thing I was going to mention is that I think this also happens at times where work that is not traditional or in a traditional space, if an organization is taking their work out into the community or into a venue that's really not similar to what is their typical performance venue, that it can be, not always, becomes something that is separate and considered like the community outreach or the community engagement or the education department project. And that is not to say, I feel as if the education in theater, the education departments and the education directors are some of the most outspoken activists in our field. So I think that's a positive thing that education departments are taking some of this work out into the world. But I also think that some theaters are saying, you know what, that work, it's not like there's the work that's okay for the main stage and for me and for community discussions around those themes. And then there's this other sort of less traditional approach that is more of a community engagement thing. No, they're saying it's all core. It's core because this is who we are as a theater in our community, and public value is important, and engaging all the voices is important, and lifting them all, not creating these dichotomies of value.
Also,
Thanks,
sorry.
No, go right ahead.
Also, I think what opera companies are learning very cleverly to do without letting the audiences know that the artistic director or general manager is very politically minded, and that's a deep core of who they are and how they want to run their opera company. They could present on a season Norma and Dialogues of the Carmelites and Appomattox and Lost in the Stars. All of those are very political operas. And then they could put in The Sound of Music, which is also political. But to the audiences, I have a musical and I love The Sound of Music, The Sound of Music. Not knowing that with that season, and throw in maybe even The Crucible, that The Sound of Music is just as political as all the other operas that I have just named. So that's the way of doing it. And Teresa is so right about what goes on in the regional theaters across the country, is that you can have, for instance, let's look at Arena Stage, which has 3 theaters. Zelda Fitzhandler's the founding member and now run by Molly Smith. She will have in her smaller theater called The Cradle, these new, wonderful, revolutionary kind of plays that will send the audiences literally shouting at each other about what they just saw. Great. And then in their huge theater, the Arena Stage, the Fitzhandler, you will have Newsies or a Cole Porter musical. And then in the Krieger, you will have a little bit of a cross between that. In fact, Molly has done many plays that are about the indigenous peoples. And so the theaters are learning, like the opera houses are learning, how to get across what personally is important to them, living up to their mission, satisfying their board, satisfying their subscribers and single ticket holders, but really doing the plays that really, and the operas that mean something to them and mean something to where we are in this span of life right now as individuals, as a community, as a world coming together.
And Taz, a quick follow-up there. At Manhattan School of Music, how are you preparing your young singers so that the dichotomy does not start there?
Oh, let me just preface that by saying very quickly, I'm so happy that you've asked me to be a part of this, but this is the busiest time of year, and I knew that this is my first school year, and April going into May and all of May is juries and evaluations and recitals and productions. And so I'm in the midst of this. Tonight is our gala, tomorrow is commencement. And what I have done with my two classes is, when I first arrived anyway in August, I said there will be no productions on stage. We are not going to have sets and scenery and costumes and wigs and makeup and crew and designers because of COVID. But we will, for those who would like to be in the theater, we will do certain operas, certain scenes from operas rather, where we are fully masked and we can sing 6 or 7 feet apart. For singers, it's more than that. I didn't do that. I've prepared my students in my classes. You are now going out into the world where you will probably have to not go to a specific place for an audition. And these opera companies coming to New York or San Francisco or Chicago, where you will have to come up with your own video of yourself, not just singing and holding on to a piano, but creating a movie, creating a scene. In fact, next week are my 2 evenings of my students doing just that. We're doing scenes from operas, we're doing arias, we're doing musical theater, we're doing poetry, because that's the world that they're going to be going out into now. They have to prepare themselves, yes, to be able to sing those scenes from the great standard warhorse operas, but they also need to know what's out there that's new. I've introduced them to some of the new operas, and there'll be some of my students who will be singing from these new pieces. And musical theater. Find an aria or a musical theater solo that connects to you, but you really do need to conquer that, especially if you want to go out and work after graduation. Very few of you are going to be hired unless it's going to be as a young artist, probably covering a role or singing in the chorus, but you will get jobs on Broadway. And when you look at the big Broadway shows that require big singing, those students come from Manhattan School of Music and Curtis and Juilliard. And then I introduced poetry from the very beginning because they need to know what they're singing about. I remember a dear friend who is no longer with us, Jesse Norman, who said to me, I know what the music is. I want to know exactly what I'm singing, not just how I feel through the music. What am I singing about? What are these words? And she says, sometimes I'll go back and look at other poetry. Yep. So that's how I'm hopefully.
Well, Tess, thank you for that. And just before we're out of time, I want to again touch on something that's been asked here and that Torrie again talked about, but I'm directed to John and to Reed. You know, in getting your board, your donors, your stakeholder family with you in doing a work like One Vote One or doing the wonderful series of works, Reed, that you've done, what's the story you've told that have brought people along with you, John?
Oh, we did, I think as Torrie was saying, we told the story. We told the story of what we were trying to do with this and the story of what it was going to be. I remember talking to my board about it and they were all on board. I'm very fortunate in that respect, as my board is very trusting and they want to deal with these issues.
Reed?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of education of the trustees. With As One, we were able to show the trailer. And there was some hesitancy when we first started down this road, but they were all willing to take a risk in terms of the trustees. I did also meet with major funders to explain what we were doing and why. And one of the major donors said, I appreciate what you're doing. I'm probably not going to attend, but they just still donated at their normal level. So I think that, again, being transparent and communicating goes a long way.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Reed, thank you. Antonio, let me turn it back to you. Those were the two clusters of questions about story. How do you overcome resistance, some storytelling, and how do we not create a dichotomy between the old and the new? Back to you, Antonio.
Thank you, Mark. Well, actually, I think we're close to time, and thank you all for this wonderful discussion. I think we gave folks a lot of really good things to think about and tips for when they do the next round of the civic practice grants. And hopefully we compel some of our colleagues to join us in doing this work, because I'm concerned about the lifespan of the operatic art form, right? This is the history of opera. And I think we have an opportunity here to make sure that opera continues into perpetuity. And this is the way to do it, by making it relevant to so many people and so many different people's lives. So thank you all so much for this discussion today. And we're at time. So I hope that those of you listening will join us for the case studies that will follow next.
So thank you again, Antonio, and thanks to everyone on the panel. And as Antonio says, we have 6 extremely interesting case studies. You can join any of them that you wish to join. Each of them will explore specific projects and the decision process by which the producers and creators elected to use opera to deliver a powerful message of justice and inclusion. The case studies are Anchorage Opera as One, with Reed Smith, Judy Berry, Laura Kaminsky, Kimberly Reed, and Alexandra Enyart. The Glimmerglass Festival on Blue with Francesco Zambello and Tazwell Thompson. Long Beach Opera on Central Park 5 with Jenny Rivera and Darrell Akon. Nashville Opera on One Vote One with John Humes and Dave Ragland. Opera Parallel on Harvey Milk, an upcoming production with Nicole Paimon and Daniel Harvey. And then Whitesnake Projects on Death by Life with Cerise Jacobs, Alice Kim, and Ronaldo Hudson. You can access all of our sessions, schedules, links, and recordings of the conference on our hub. It is operaamerica.org/operaconf2021. It's in the chat. It'll also be on the final screen. And let me just say that coming up on Monday at 2 o'clock Eastern time, we have the lead presentation on achieving a new normal. The presentation by organizational design specialist Julian Chender. We do on Monday evening have a special conversation with John Holliday. That's at 7 p.m. Eastern. And then, of course, our next general session panel next Wednesday. So all of that is upcoming. But in the meantime, I hope you'll join one of the case studies. And thanks so much for being with us this afternoon.